Hi, I'm going to present my panel presentation. I'm having some tech issues, so I'm hoping everything works out. So my case study is on translanguaging for Indigenous language reclamation. My name is Carmen Gavin Vanegas, and this is for L750. So before I begin the presentation, I wanted to just center myself and remember where I am. I am presenting from Minnesota Makoche, which is the traditional and current homelands of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and members of other Indigenous nations. The Indigenous people of this place continue to care for this land, the water, and the plant and animal relatives who live here. I support their work to reclaim their languages and exercise their land rights. So I'm going to just follow the outline for the paper with the exception of a small section on methodology. So I'll be going through the introduction and problem statement, description of the context and research questions. I'll talk a little bit about methodology and then go through the lit review and talk about my conclusions. All right, so the research problem is centered in the current push for movements across the world among Indigenous people for language reclamation. These movements are centered in Indigenous sovereignty, people wanting to have self-determination and political sovereignty, and also wellness and well-being. We know that youth who learn their language have better mental health, better physical health. There's a lot of research supporting language reclamation as a process of healing for Indigenous communities. Current generation of Indigenous youth in the United States, the majority of Indigenous youth here are now living in urban areas, and that is a shift that's happening globally, but it's been, I guess, advanced in the United States faster than some other places. And of course, there have been a lot of changes to schooling back from the boarding school era when Indigenous languages were not allowed to be spoken in school and people were punished for speaking them, to the current era where we now have charter schools and public schools teaching these languages. So there's been a huge shift in the use of Indigenous languages in school. Translanguaging is an ancient practice in Indigenous communities, as we'll discuss later. But the use of translanguaging in schools to support Indigenous language reclamation is quite new. And it is certainly being used, but it's under researched and under published. And when we think about decolonial perspectives on Indigenous language practices following Camelo in 2018, we really have to think about the broader perspective. So as I'm considering translanguaging for Indigenous language reclamation, I'm thinking a lot about epistemic violence, as well as the larger dimensions of reclamation. It's not just about reclaiming a grammar or words or documenting them, but looking at the functions of language in society to pass on a worldview and a set of values. So my research problem is really trying to understand how translanguaging fits into this current context of Indigenous language reclamation and how schools could use translanguaging. So before I move on, just in that vein of thinking from a decolonial lens, I wanted to look at a couple of different perspectives from people who are active in the reclamation movement in different Indigenous communities. This first quote comes from Brad Fife, an Ojibwe learner, and he says, "Our language is a living thing. It has a spirit. It's not just something written on paper or in books. Our way of life, our teachings are all built into it. Without our language, we lose our identity as well as our way of life." And then this other quote from a whole different area of the world, an Aboriginal revitalization leader, says, "Because language is culture, culture is language, language is land, land is language. Family, language, language, family. One can't live without the other. And when the people realize that, they may have a better understanding and will understand why language is important to us to revive these languages." So I think these quotes really bring that broader context into place, and I just want to stay grounded in that understanding of language as more than just a system. So the research questions that I had were, how can translanguaging be used in schools to support Indigenous language reclamation? And then how can Indigenous language reclamation movements inform translanguaging pedagogies? The significance and the goal of the case study, there's really a dearth of publications that are focused on translanguaging in Indigenous languages, especially in educational settings. It's great to learn from translanguaging practices in other contexts, but there's a really pressing need to look at the specificity of Indigenous language reclamation, because Indigenous language acquisition has different features, different needs. The languages have different characteristics, and they're in a different relationship to other languages, particularly in settler colonial societies. So I'm really looking at this case study because I work with Indigenous students who are working to reclaim their languages. And I would like to be able to support that goal in my classroom as best as possible. And I've been experimenting a lot with translanguaging. So for my doctoral research, my students are actually leading some language use, language learning activities in my science classroom. And I'm looking at what happens when they have the opportunity to design those activities and then peers have the opportunity to engage in them. So I'm hoping from this case study, I'll be able to get more background about what other people might be doing that might inspire us, and also think about, directions that we might want to go that maybe no one has gone before. So when I looked at the existing research and kind of my own knowledge base and what we talked about in class, we certainly learned about benefits of translanguaging in schools. We talked a lot about translanguaging practices and pedagogies. And I'm just going to give a very brief overview of translanguaging in Indigenous communities and in schools. I'm going to talk more about that as I get into my literature review below. So as far as benefits of translanguaging in schools, we know that transing pedagogy can help to kind of loosen up essentializing tendencies within the school. So when we think about culture-based and language-based education, they can become very static, places where we teach people what a particular identity is supposed to be about. And that can be very limiting for Indigenous students in particular, because it's often centered in how things used to be and tradition, and not really offering that flexibility to think about what it means to be modern and Indigenous, what it means to be Indigenous and perhaps multiracial, multi-ethnic, living in a city. There's a lot of layers to that and to students' identity that isn't well reflected in some of those cultural education models. So that transing pedagogy is a good way to get students thinking about themselves outside of essentialized boxes of cultural and linguistic identity. They're also a way to support language rights and people valuing Indigenous languages, even outside of Indigenous communities, just as a local land-based language. Another author one in chapter 4 talks about the translingualism as inscrutability, which means it allows people to exercise language sovereignty even in a hostile environment. And schools have often been a hostile environment for Indigenous people. So really that idea of translanguaging as maybe a trickster practice, as something that can break open those essentializing categories or open new spaces for people to exist and express themselves. Translingualism can be a tool in that way, that thinking of language in a new way. Garcia and Wei also talk about how translanguaging pedagogies can support creativity and criticality among students, transforming their education by blending ways of knowing that are traditionally found in different spaces. And for me, that's very powerful because I'm thinking about bringing language into our content classes and considering how translanguaging can help students think about content on a deeper level and bring in those different epistemologies, not just different languages, but the different worldviews that go with those languages. Translanguaging practices and pedagogies. Some key elements that we talked about in class were teachers as co-learners. That's really critical with Indigenous languages because a lot of languages, the documentation is limited. maybe only one variety has been documented. And so students may be bringing different vocabulary, different grammar, because of the variety that their family has passed to them. And so even a teacher who's gone through and taken some classes in one of these languages, they're not going to have, there's that cultural humility piece. Even teachers who teach Ojibwe or Dakota, they're learning from their students every day. So that role of teacher is going to be really important in translanguaging. And also a lot of teachers haven't had the opportunity because there aren't very many classes in those languages or opportunities to learn. So, teachers may not know and may need to just learn the language from the students. School-wide multilingual ecology, not just what language is used in instruction, but all the spaces and ways language and different cultures and epistemologies are showing up in the way we do school and in the school environment, whether it's like what we have on the walls or the way that we schedule our day or run our classes. So that's a really important element when we're thinking about kind of decolonizing education and using translanguaging to do that. Lastly, the leadership role for students, definitely really important with translanguaging pedagogy is allowing the students to share out things that they may have access to through a language or background experiences they have with others, rather than the teacher being the source of knowledge. And then there are roles for things like word walls and translation in the classroom, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of some limitations to those approaches later. Translanguaging in Indigenous communities is a norm and a tradition long before it has been named in the research literature. Oliver Wigglesworth, Angelo, and Steele in 2021 wrote, traditionally, Aboriginal people were multilingual in their traditional languages. At the very least, most Aboriginal people spoke 2 languages and or dialects, minimally their own mother tongue, and an additional language, often with broader communicative reach. And similarly, within the US context, Lemoima and McCarty talk about a very long history of post-colonization translanguaging, specifically in schools, and the ways that students subverted and worked around and escaped sometimes boarding school in order to maintain their languages. And then the ways schools tried to kind of subsume language and make it part of a colonizing curriculum. And yet Native teachers always found spaces and ways to use language in that kind of sense of inscrutability we talked about earlier to continue to pass on cultural values and worldview. So certainly translanguaging is nothing new to Indigenous communities, but using translanguaging in schools for language reclamation is a newer concept. So this is a new area of research. Oliver Wigglesworth, Angelo, and Steele looked at some examples of translanguaging practices. I'll talk about those more in the lit review that draw on students' rich linguistic competencies. Hernandez Campos and Suniga Siskind also looked at translanguaging practices specifically in the context of speech pathology evaluation of Maya students in US schools. So I want to talk briefly about my methodology. This is a case study. I looked at existing research and just did a qualitative theme-based analysis. But I also was thinking a lot about Indigenous methodologies. There's one that we use a lot in school called Debwewin Journey by Gale, published in 2012. And it's really thinking about a lot of times when we're using academic sources, we call this mind knowledge. There's a lot of valuable information there, but there's a lot that's missing. There are a lot of things happening in the community and that have happened, so historically and currently, that aren't reflected there. And there's a lot of value in the oral tradition and land-based learning and a lot of other spaces. And so I don't want to just review published literature in that mind knowledge category. I also want to come back to that heart knowledge in the community and make some connections between those two types of literature or types of sources of information. So I searched the Indiana University and University of Minnesota library databases for articles and books. I looked for Indigenous language reclamation and translanguaging, revitalization and translanguaging, Indigenous languages and translanguaging, and I also looked for translanguaging and land. I focused on articles from settler colonial context, Australia, New Zealand, US, and Canada, just because more similar to where I'm working, and the relationship between languages is more similar. However, I did look at articles that discuss translanguaging in other Indigenous communities around the world, especially among youth or in schools. And then because there's just so little out there, I also included literature on Indigenous language pedagogies that could be relevant for the application of translanguaging. And I looked at some of the background literature, which I reviewed previously in the introduction on translanguaging in classrooms. So I read my articles and book chapters. I identified key themes. I connected them to oral tradition, community-based, and land-based learning. And then I made some recommendations and drew some conclusions about my research questions. So key themes in the literature review were translanguaging as an old and new practice in Indigenous communities, translanguaging as a decolonizing practice, and kind of considering what relational translanguaging could look like. And then lastly, translanguaging to support Indigenous language reclamation in schools and some of the challenges that arise with Indigenous language reclamation. So translanguaging is a practice that has been a tradition in many communities and continues to evolve. Wyman was looking at linguistic survivance among Yupik youth and was looking at views of translanguaging among elders and youth. And although translanguaging is a long-standing tradition in the community, because of the recent shift toward English and English-based schooling, elders were interpreting translanguaging among the youth as meaning that those youth were not learning the language and they weren't speaking the Indigenous language with them then, because they were assuming that those youth were just shifting into English. Whereas youth were looking at their language in a more flexible way, being able to express themselves in English and also in Yupik and wanting to continue learning the language. So that just brought up an interesting question about kind of what new versions of translanguaging look like and how accepted they are in the community, and how schools might, play a role in that. Simungala, Jemima, and Chikuta also talked about translanguaging. They were specifically looking at Zambian Indigenous languages and English, and they were just saying, hey, among youth, this is really widespread practice. Using their Indigenous languages, even languages that might not typically be written, they're texting in them, they're messaging in them, they're posting in them on social media. And so they are talking a little bit about some of the ways translanguaging looks different among the young people than it might have looked in previous generations. Krupa 2013 was talking about strategically using translanguaging for Arikara language reclamation. And he states that regardless of one's language proficiency, speaking level, and accuracy of pronunciation, one must use the language as often as possible and in any context. Speaking one Arikara word in an English sentence is a start, a place from which to build on language learning. So he's speaking from a community where there are no the word he uses, fluent, there are no fluent speakers of their language. They're trying to wake up a language that's been sleeping. So it's really important that people just use the language as much as possible. And they're like coining new terms as they're translanguaging, like he was talking about coming up with new words to use when playing basketball. And so it's just a very generative and dynamic process. And of course, that's going to be different than the way that their ancestors translanguaged, because they weren't trying to wake up a sleeping language. Garcia also wrote a reflection at the end of this book that Krupa is writing in on Indigenous language reclamation, and really emphasizes the importance of studying youth practices and how youth are translanguaging using their linguistic resources in theorizing and developing policy and practice recommendations for reclamation. So I think that applies clearly to this situation. We're trying to come up with practice recommendations for translanguaging, and we really have to let the youth lead with the way that they're already using language. She said it's important to acknowledge the multi-layered dynamism of the bilingualism of Indigenous youth and fluid language practices. So instead of looking at it from a deficit viewpoint and saying the language is dying, it's endangered, to really say, wow, the language is being used in new ways and in new, combined in new ways with other linguistic resources that might not have been in the past. What does that mean? And really thinking about language planning and policy in terms of like, what is it important to preserve about a language or continue to carry forward in a language, and what are things that it's okay if they shift. And a lot of it has to do with those epistemologies and worldviews that are behind the way we use language. All right, so in his 2019 dissertation, became a published book, Keksa talks about Dakota writing during the Allotment and assimilation period. And most of this writing was taking place in English, but he's talking about how these Dakota authors were really preserving and passing down their worldview in the way that they were using English. So it's a deep level of translanguaging, a deep level of like they were sending inscrutable, right, opaque messages to other Dakota people in the way they were writing in English. It was invisible to readers in English. And so I think that's a really powerful testament to the complexity of translanguaging. It's not always about what languages are being used on the surface, whether the person's code switching. It's really about like what worldviews, what epistemologies, what language influences are behind the writing. Dorfler, Sinclair, and Stark also talked about the importance of translanguaging and modeled using translanguaging as a in story work, generating new stories as part of their work in Anishinaabe studies. And then really the main takeaway here is that translanguaging can be an act of expressing identity and survivance, and it's generative, and it doesn't signify extinction or loss of culture. And it's easy to miss that if you're not looking under the surface. So some connections I made to just our in-class learning, land-based learning, community learning. George Banga was a translator, Ojibwe translator, that worked a lot between Ojibwe and English. And so it's really interesting when we look at history, like this is the 1800s, we already have someone who is very proficient at translanguaging through treaty negotiations and really understanding not just the language, but like the worldviews and being able to negotiate. So this really shows how this skill has been traditionally valued and important in Indigenous communities. An example of young people doing translanguaging is this video, is the Dakota 24-hour challenge. It's pretty funny and fun. Some elders were pretty upset with them for recording this video. It just didn't seem very, they're not treating the language as this like sacred thing. They're treating it really as the language that they play around with, and they're, you know, translanguaging through there in English and Spanish. It's very much the way a lot of youth are using their Indigenous languages. And it's, for my students, a lot of them spoke about this video being very empowering. So in my science class, students translanguage all the time. And sometimes those, it's translanguaging that is visible on the surface, like these examples below, where you can see the code switching, right? The actually separate identifiable languages. But then there's also a lot that happens in English where students are like thinking in an Ojibwe way or a Dakota way while speaking English. And we had an author here, Carter Meland. He's Ojibwe. He didn't know he was Ojibwe until he was an adult. And that isn't that uncommon. People lose connection with their community and find it. And so it was interesting listening to him talk about he's trying to learn to speak Ojibwe, and he included some Ojibwe in his book. And some elders came and said, "You use this Ojibwe wrong." And he was like, "Well, you know, this book reflects where I was in my language journey at the time." And you know, really trying to honor his own language practices and his own translanguaging, even though maybe it doesn't reflect where he'd like to be translanguaging 25 years from now. So I just wanted to say that there's a lot of translanguaging happening in the world, and that has happened in the world, that's not getting labeled or written up in research. Wang in New Zealand did some work on translanguaging as a decolonizing practice. Is really interesting looking at using translanguaging in Chinese language class, but integrating Indigenous epistemologies and the Maori language. So what was really interesting about this was like, this was a, you know, foreign language or world language class, Most of the students weren't Maori, but they had been exposed to some Maori in their schooling because New Zealand schools do have bilingual programming for all students. And so Wang really talks about how the nexus between translanguaging and decoloniality needs to be further explored. There's so much possibility in what she calls cross-civilizational learning through translanguaging, allowing students to really think across worldviews and understand how they're similar and different. In particular, she talked a lot about a project she did on families and students understanding how family is constructed kind of in the Maori worldview and language, and then in the Chinese worldview and language, and what was similar and different about that. Hene Ochoa, I would say, is an important connection to this. They never discussed translanguaging, but this article discusses how Indigenous understandings of language are a lot more than just language as a grammar, language as a system, language as a dictionary and list of words. It's really intertwined with concepts of language, identity, and thought. And he says language ideology in Indigenous communities, particularly thinking about reclamation, it's an ideology of language as a process of sustaining relationality. That's really deep. But I think it relates back to this idea of how do we think from a decolonial perspective about translanguaging. Wilson, 2001, 2008, also focused a lot on relationality in Indigenous knowledge systems, looks at research as a ceremony, knowledge as a relationship, and even says, like, in his Indigenous culture, self is a relationship. Like, you don't exist outside your relationship to your relatives around you. So one question is, what does this mean for translanguaging when it's sometimes posited as like an individual phenomenon, like an individual's linguistic resources? So one question would be about how we could situate translanguaging in relationships rather than just in individuals. There's a lot of generativity that's coming from translanguaging in the community. Again, no one's using this word translanguaging, but like the Nibit water song, Doreen Day is a grandma. She talked about writing this song with her grandson because he first was wanting to thank the water every day, to tell the water, like, we love you, we respect you, we thank you. And then he said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could do it in our language? And so, you know, it was actually translating this into Ojibwe and then thinking from an Ojibwe perspective about how do we talk to water? What is our relationship to water? Another example is we had an elder come, Charles Grola, and tell Ojibwe bird stories. He had learned from elders at Red Lake. This book is mostly in English, but the bird names and some of the other words in there in Ojibwe, and it's very strategic in terms of the way that he uses language to help students build a relationship to the birds and a relationship to the stories. Another example is we visit a sacred site called Wakan Tipi, and an artist named Marlena Miles made an augmented reality there, and it's bilingual. There's Dakota. In this augmented reality, there are Dakota spirits and historical figures speaking. And then there is also English in there, but really coming from a Dakota perspective or a Dakota worldview. And it's trying to help people connect to the land in a different way. So you walk through this sacred site that's being restored under Dakota leadership. And then you're hearing from these spirits and historical figures about the history of this place and its significance in Dakota and English. So I think there's so much potential for translanguaging as a decolonizing practice. A lot of it is happening in the community and not ending up in research papers. When we look at translanguaging to support Indigenous language reclamation in schools, there's certainly been a long tradition of bilingual practice and translanguaging in schools. Lomoaima and McCarty talk specifically about the termination era and how there were some readers produced in that era, for example, in Dene. And the translators that were writing the text intentionally, like, they subverted the meaning of it in English as they wrote it in their own language. And it was done in such a way that it reconnected, like one of the texts is about the American flag and it's about patriotism. And the way that it talks about land and stuff is very colonial. And then when the text in Dene is examined, it's really talking about land and our connection to land as a homeland. So it's just interesting how like translanguaging has been used for a very long period of time as a way to move from what Indigenous educators call the safety zone, kind of like Indigenous culture as an exotic, non-threatening, food and festivals, to moving into zones of sovereignty where Indigenous educators were working with their students, trying to help them maintain those cultural epistemological differences, that sovereignty, and prepare them to continue to have that autonomy as a community and self-determination. So there have been a lot of efforts more recently to create immersion schools like the Rough Rock Demonstration School in Dene, Wadu Kodading School in Ojibwe. And certainly, although these schools are immersion schools, a lot of the work to create the curriculum and a lot of what happens in the school is translanguaging. So when you look in the literature, there's such a much more limited range of documentation out there than what's really happening. Oliver Wigglesworth, Angela, and Steele, as I mentioned in the introduction, looked at translanguaging with Aboriginal learners in Australia. What was really good about this study is that they looked at the many different languages, idiolects, whatever you want to call systems of communication that students had access to. And they were like, wow, we have different varieties of English, we have Creoles, we have Indigenous languages, and we have students that have different mastery of all of these, plus kind of what they call standard Australian English. And so they were just examining in classrooms, how are students and teachers drawing on all their language resources? When students are encouraged and teachers are open, what does that look like? They also brought up, as I mentioned previously, that translanguaging is a tradition, but it certainly hasn't been a tradition in schools. So they were really looking at how these translanguaging approaches can focus on the persistence of language and not ideologies of endangerment, like this language is dying. It's like this language has changed. Maybe now it's part of a Creole. Maybe now people are using it and translanguaging in this language in English. But really looking at how that is being done from the perspective of survivance. People are continuing to pass the culture down and the cultural values and worldviews, as well as from a creative and critical perspective, particularly thinking about colonial school systems. How are students kind of maybe sometimes subverting or bringing their own worldview back into a system that doesn't often include it? The other study that focuses on translanguaging was Hernandez Campos and Zuniga Siskind, and they really weren't looking at language reclamation. They were just looking at equity around evaluating for speech-language pathology students who are primary Maya speakers. But they do look at kind of the possibility that translanguaging could extend beyond the speech-language pathology office and be part of the student's education, particularly looking at how they draw on all of their linguistic resources to communicate and how they could build on that to improve their communication across languages. When we look at those kind of existing models of translanguaging that we saw in the introduction, there are certainly many ways that they need to maybe be rethought or expanded to really include that Indigenous worldview of what language is. So Chiblo and Magon were talking about the relationship between translanguaging and land. And a couple important quotes were Anishinaabeg connection, reciprocity, and responsibility are embedded in the language, along with Anishinaabeg ways of knowing and being. And then the other author stated, to me, Indigenous languages and the land are one and the same. This symbiotic relationship encompasses so many levels: the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical. So certainly thinking of translanguaging as more than just linguistic resources, but actually more worldview resources, epistemological resources, axiological resources. The other piece is really thinking about language as a living being and translanguaging as a relationship between beings, because translanguaging deeply reflects those connections that we have with people who live around us, with the land we're on, And certainly for my Indigenous students, like there's a lot of discussion about like what language spirits speak, what language animals speak. So being able to connect to certain relatives requires a certain language. Translanguaging is also, because it's living, it's generative, right? It's creating new relationships, building on those Indigenous epistemologies across languages and idiolects, or however you want to talk about those linguistic resources. But students are able to use those ways of thinking as they move across languages. So there's definitely a lot of, there are many challenges to Indigenous reclamation taking place in schools. Of course, there's the long history of boarding schools, and there are a lot of logistical challenges around, like, you know, finding speakers that have teacher certification and can jump through the hoops and all that. But in terms of like kind of broader issues that translanguaging could address, Hermes and Dyke discuss the epistemological conflicts of teaching to state standards in Ojibwe. So these are standards that are centered in like a very Eurocentric way of thinking, settler colonial worldviews. And then you're trying to translate this curriculum into Ojibwe and it just doesn't work. And so it's sort of like you're teaching English in Ojibwe or you're teaching this worldview in Ojibwe. It doesn't go together well. Limerick also discusses in his study of the bilingual education policies in Ecuador that there's this double-edged sword element to it, where on the one hand, you know, legitimating language in school can be so powerful. Like students can, from other multiple backgrounds, can come to value this language. And he's specifically talking about Quechua in Ecuador. But at the same time, like raising up that language, and particularly a specific regional variant of that language, because once we start teaching a language and incorporating it in instruction, we're kind of validating or valorizing a particular variant. All of a sudden, we've created a new hierarchy. And, you know, if you're creating new vocabulary, like Hermes and Dyke talk about doing in Ojibwe, we're creating vocabulary to talk about Western science concepts. All of a sudden, you're influencing the language and the way people think in the language in a way that may or may not be good. It's just worth really thinking about. He also talks about the role of translanguaging, ironically, as often keeping language in the safety zone, people using that Indigenous language just in their introduction and then shifting into Spanish so that everyone around can understand. And there's no question of whether they're being subversive or there's, you know, any secret or inscrutable messages being passed on. So I just thought these were really important articles to bring in, even though they don't specifically say anything about translanguaging. They're both talking about the reality of translanguaging. So I think the key things that I took away from looking at this literature and pulling out the themes, translanguaging is a really important frame to use for understanding problems with immersion programs and just with language reclamation in schools in general, because it helps us think about students and the whole linguistic resources and worldviews and epistemologies that they're bringing, and why it doesn't work to just translate one language into another, why students really have to draw on multiple linguistic systems to be able to access those different worldviews. And once they're able to do that, they can actually move across languages and continue to do it. Like they can express an Ojibwe worldview in English, but that's like an advanced skill, and we need to bring in those other languages for that skill to be developed. Translanguaging is definitely a great alternative to ideologies of endangerment. So instead of thinking of languages as like students as being not fluent, not proficient, not competent, it's like, wow, you're translanguaging, you're using your language every day, even if it's in little bits and pieces. And you're using it in new and generative ways that express your identity, and really be able to affirm and validate that for students, I think is important. Translanguaging is also a great way to embrace the full language repertoires of Indigenous youth, meaning not just their Indigenous languages, but also the varieties of English that they speak and the mixed language that they speak, and just all the ways they bring together their linguistic resources to communicate. And often those other resources are not valorized. So it is important, like particularly when we think about trying to do immersion, are we valorizing the way students already speak at home? And helping them draw on that and use that in whatever language we're using in school. And then translanguaging is also I guess the deeper piece for me was thinking about it as an expression of the relationships between relatives, land, and worldviews, and how we could really draw on that, as Wang said, to try to decolonize. So some recommendations that I would make going forward, I think it's really important that the research literature explore the intersections and contradictions between decolonial studies, indigenous methodologies, and ways of knowing, and translanguaging. And I know there are some, and some authors brought this up, some incommensurabilities, like maybe because decolonial studies really focuses on like being able to name groups and talk about power relationships, maybe that doesn't even mesh with the translanguaging, where we're trying to not name languages and groups and say that they're separate things. But I think it's okay to bring together, I mean, that's really what we're doing when we translanguage. We're bringing together worldviews that sometimes like aren't compatible, but looking at it from both perspectives, kind of using that two-eyed seeing approach can be really valuable to help us understand things on a deeper level. So I think looking at indigenous methodologies, indigenous pedagogies, and thinking about how has translanguaging traditionally been practiced in this community? How does it look now? How do we draw on the ways people already use translanguaging in the way we teach? I think a big question that came up for me was, what would translanguaging for reclamation look like when reclamation includes epistemologies, axiologies, language, ways of life, and land? It's not just about being able to competently communicate across these different languages, but it's really being able to competently function across very disparate worldviews and ways of knowing. And so I think that's a deep, deep question. It's way easier to code switch and, say that you're translanguaging in the classroom than it is to really deeply look at the ways that our school culture might be inhibiting students from translanguaging on this deeper level. Because the way that we practice teaching, learning, and just showing up to school is very rooted in one culture's worldview. Lastly, an important recommendation is thinking about how translanguaging pedagogies will make space for epistemological differences rather than standardizing how language should be used. So what I mean by that is, obviously, like, translanguaging is happening all the time, whether or not we name it. If we're in an immersion school in Ojibwe, just translating curriculum into Ojibwe from English, or, I'm here in my classroom and students are coming up with if they're coming up with words for science concepts, in English that only exist in Ojibwe, or in Ojibwe that only exist in English, it can be really challenging to not kind of translate that cultural worldview over right along with the word and miss the way that other culture might see that concept. And I think like word walls, it's that sort of a mentality that like we're going to have a translation of these words and they're all lined up and every language has an equivalent. It's stepping back and saying it's okay for them to be different. It's okay for a language to not have this, and what does that mean? And not from a deficit viewpoint, but from like a viewpoint of what's important in that culture. Why are certain things valued or talked about? And why does this language have words that language doesn't have? It's not just that English has words that Ojibwe doesn't have, but Ojibwe has a bunch of words English doesn't too. So I guess for me, at the end of the day, I'm really interested in seeing how youth will kind of reflect on their own translanguaging practices and how they see themselves bringing those into the classroom, and then how their peers respond. So that's where I'll be going for my dissertation research. I realized that my reference slide got messed up. And so I'm going to actually upload that as a doc after. I don't think that you need to hear me read that or anything. So I guess I just wanted to come back to my research questions at the end to make sure that I discuss how we answer those. So I definitely think translanguaging can be used, is already being used, has been used in schools to support Indigenous language reclamation, but certainly we can become a lot more skillful in the way that we use it to support kind of broader Indigenous worldviews and epistemologies within the schooling context, and also to really validate the way youth are using language. Indigenous language reclamation movements can inform translanguaging pedagogies by thinking about how relationships and land and I guess just connection could be centered in translanguaging rather than thinking about kind of that individual idiolect or individual language. Because really, a lot of that meaning and generativity comes from the way we're understanding each other. So this case study was really rich. I learned a lot, and I hope you have enjoyed listening. Thank you.